Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Following the Welsh Parliament refusing to provide legislative consent to the UK government's internal market bill, which now sits awaiting royal consent after clearing ping-pong in the UK Parliament, we tonight host a debate amongst various members of the Welsh Labour Party about what the party's constitutional response to the IMB should be. With us this evening, we have Mick Antoniw, member of the Senedd for Pontypridd and chair of the Welsh Parliament's Legislation, Justice and Constitution Committee. Hi, Mick.
Hi there. Good to see you.
Thank you very much for coming on. We've got Harriet Protheroe-Soltani, who's a trade unionist and vice chair of Momentum. Hello, Harriet.
Hi, Matt.
And we have Ben Gwalchmai, co-founder of Labour for an Independent Wales and candidate for the Welsh Parliament's Mid and West Wales seat for Labour. Hello, Ben.
Hello, noswaith.
Thanks for coming. So the Internal Market Bill has just passed, and I think we've all got very strong views on that, and I'm sure we'll get into them. But what do we think Welsh Labour's constitutional response should be to the Internal Market Bill? Harriet, do you want to start?
Kind of thought about this in two ways. I've thought the kind of immediate response and then the more longer term response from the Welsh Labour Party. And just to open this up for a bit of context, we should all note that Nicola Sturgeon has called this bill an abomination almost on every level. And we can see similar comments from Jeremy Miles as well, who has put in that legal challenge very recently. And I think, to be very, very frank, Welsh Labour needs to go on the attack. I think we need all ministers in unison to launch a coordinated campaign against the Westminster government, to take up as much press as they can and really shine a light on how Westminster is treating the Welsh Parliament and Welsh parliamentarians. I think Welsh Labour needs to show some strong leadership on this, otherwise we may as well pack up and go home. What's the point of devolution if devolution can't defend itself? So I think also in the context of all of the people that have recently joined Yes Cymru, there are a huge voter base that Welsh Labour could speak to here on this issue. And time again, I've said that Labour needs to address this head on and start talking about the national question in broader terms of independence or not, etc. So I think this is where we need to go in the immediate term. I'll let someone else come in. I've got much bigger plans for the longer term, but go on.
Mick, what do you think? What should be the response of Welsh Labour?
Well, firstly, I mean, the response should be what we've been saying from the Senedd and from the Welsh Government, and indeed on a cross-party basis almost, certainly from Plaid and from Labour and from one or two Conservatives as well, is that firstly, it is a power grab, it undermines democracy, and also it is an exponent of the lack of trust that you can actually have in the type of government that Boris Johnson is leading. So that's the crux of it. Firstly, it emphasises the breakdown of trust, which is fundamental to the relationships between the four nations. But what it also does is expose really the dysfunctionality of the constitutional arrangement we have, and the fact that I think there is a political power struggle going on. I think you have a right-wing Conservative government whose objective at the moment is to recalibrate devolution, to re-centralise power. So I think this is deliberate. You know, the government, they say it is economic. It is not economic. This is a power grab. It is a reassertion of power, and it is based on a growing concept of a British nationalism. Now, what we need a response to on that is what we need to kick off this constitutional convention that we're interested in. I see Keir Starmer has said that there is now going to be one. We need the detail of that. But that has got to drive forward a whole new ideological analysis of what the purpose of the UK is, if there is a purpose to the UK. That is the question. We know there are events in Scotland taking place, and that, of course, may catalyse events more quickly than we actually expect after the elections in May. But we need to have an ideological socialist response to those events. I think we have most of the groundwork is actually there. We now need to put it within a political framework.
That's all great. I agree with all of that, so long as we keep all options in mind and don't fall back on 200-year ideas about federalism. I would say that it's fantastic to see the Council General's response, which has, yesterday said, if you put this through for royal assent, then essentially the Welsh Government will be taking UK Government to court. And that's a great first response. But from there, I think the Welsh Labour Party, as the party of government, not only needs to have an agreement cross parties, not just with the SNP as the Scottish Government, they need to be working with all the governments apart from the UK Government of the UK, and they need to be considering the kind of things that Clive Lewis has already talked about and that's complete structural reform for the UK as a whole. That's including England and more. I've been saying, as the co-founder of Labour for Indie Wales for the past 4 years, get ahead of this stuff. We saw it back in June of last year when Carwyn and Mark were talking about the constitutional graffiti of the UK Parliament becoming sovereign in law and on statute. And then that actually went through, and officially UK Parliament is sovereign and nothing else is, even though both Carwyn and Mark believe that sovereignty should be, if not is, shared. But if it's not on statute, and this is what we're discovering more and more with the UK government, if it's not on statute, they will go around it or they'll bulldoze it. So we have to get everything we can through the Supreme Court in agreement with other governments across party, and we have to change what's on statute to make it a lasting change. And that can be our position as a party: reform, reform, reform.
So you talked about reform. A lot of people say that needs structure. A lot of people have talked about confederalism. Carwyn's talked about confederalism. Others in the party talked federalism. Others in the party have talked independence. How do you get to those things? What would allow you to achieve that change, Ben?
So if we talk about the sort of official processes that I can see as routes towards confederalism, or opening up that reform question and not, again, simply falling back on the same thing that David Lloyd George talked about in federalism. Obviously, it can come from grassroots, it can come from CLPs. Part of the progress of Labour for New Wales is to, in the next year, literally next year, is to start a proper campaign of debates and discussion, much like the previous OMOV campaign. And obviously, OMOV came to Cymru kind of in a similar vein, because it was passed in the English Labour or UK Labour Party first. But it can happen in reverse. It has happened with other things in reverse, and the right campaign could do it. A campaign is an excellent first step to raise that awareness and also encourage discussion through other movements like Yes Cymru, like Harriet said. I think that for us in Labour for New Wales, the campaign is the first step, but then so much of it is involving big voices like Mick, and it's amazing to have him chatting about this now, and others in time, and then seeing where it goes. Obviously, we're a democratic party. No one's going to be forcing any other opinion on anyone. But in time, I personally think there will be momentous things happening over the next few years, like Scottish independence, like a change in leadership in the Welsh Labour Party. And that could bring with it its own difference. So I think there are so many opportunities to that change within Welsh Labour that I hope very much that UK Labour are open to them as well.
Well, it's nice to see Ben putting his leadership bid down early. He's not even elected yet. I think in terms of answering your question of how we need to get there, I think that the Welsh Labour Party needs to be on the front foot with this. And I think we need to start openly seeing members of the Welsh Parliament saying that they're in favour of independence, because there are members that we know who are, that have been very silent on it and very scared to open up this discussion. So my question to those assembly members has always been, what are you scared of? Are you scared of being told off internally by the party for representing the interests of the nation, or are you scared of losing votes?
Listen. Let's come into this and let's get this back down to the politics of what it's about. The first thing is there's a real problem with the nationalist arguments that's being put, because at the moment it's being presented as independence is the solution to just about everything. It reminds me, of the old Lib Dem penny on income tax. It appeared on everything. Well, we can pay for this, provided we have the 1p increase on income tax, and then it would appear somewhere else, and so on. And we have to get away from the sort of simplistic view that the idea is independence, whatever that means within a global capitalist world, etc., needs to actually start being defined as to what is being talked about, as opposed to being a reactive thing to I don't like Boris Johnson, I don't like this right-wing Tory government, etc., therefore the way out of it is, etc. So there's a bigger question than that. But can I say that the politics of this is this? What do we want a constitutional convention to be considering? For me, this isn't about creating national blocks, whether it's an English bloc, a Scottish bloc, a Welsh bloc, or whatever. It's about the decentralisation of power. For socialist devolution has always been about the decentralisation of power. And we're not just looking about creating an English parliament, a Welsh parliament, a Scottish parliament. It's got to be more than that. It's got to look at the handing power down as close as possible to communities. It is about the empowerment of communities. And that's where I actually separate myself from the sort of, perhaps the harder lines of some of the nationalist movements, which actually see it as sort of nation above all. I don't. I see this about empowerment of people, and I see it very much from a class position as well. So I think the ideology of what a constitutional convention, which is going to happen, let's make no mistake, that constitutional convention on a UK-wide basis is the most significant step to take place in terms of constitutional reform.
You and I, both socialists in the party, both have very similar aims and similar goals, and I would agree. It's about devolving power down to the lowest level that we can and empowering individuals in their communities. We, as a British left, have tried to get a socialist government in Westminster year on year. The most radical government that we just tried to have got roundly rejected by nearly every part of the formalised state, including the British media. So if you can show me a route to socialism through the British state, then I'm more than happy to come on that with you. But we've tried and we failed time and time again. So I think we do need to look at the politics of rupture here, and how rupturing a British state and the establishments that come with it that oppress socialist voices and socialist values could be a route towards socialism.
Well, I don't think socialism comes through state powers. I actually think it comes through the empowerment of people. And I think that is the actual core definition of what socialism is actually about. And for me, what the ultimate objective of the Labour Party is. And I think we mustn't also delude ourselves. The concept of independent will somehow result in some sort of left. I mean, I think there is so much mythology that suddenly there would be this utopian sort of socialist government would appear. You know, let's face it, one of the strongest growing political parties in Wales at the moment is actually the Conservative Party. If we want to look at the situation of politics in the working class at the moment, look at the Brexit vote as well. So we mustn't, you know, we have a certain romanticized mythology about what politics is in Wales and what it would lead to. So just having a different, separate parliament with independence, precisely whatever that meant, etc., is a far more complex political question. I think we have to start from fundamental principles as to what we think the UK should be, what the power base, what its purpose should be, and where Wales would fit within that if that's what it chose to do. And that seems to be the question, what Wales, the people of Wales ultimately would choose to do if they were given options.
All of these questions come down to structures, right? In December, if all of Wales and all of Scotland had voted unanimously for Labour, England would still have needed to have voted either a majority or close, very, very close, within 2 seats of a majority of Labour for there to be a Labour government in the UK. Mm-hmm. So structurally, if we talk about what the UK is, what it's for, we would hope that a state was for fair representation. But the UK does not offer that, and it does not want to change. However, we can look at different structures and we can change it. And, you know, then we have to ask, if we cannot get that through the UK and the structures they're in, because they are being set up by the Conservatives in London, but more than that, they have been for 200 years. They have been set up in various unfair ways to the periphery. And we're not just talking about Cymru here, we're talking about Scotland, we're talking about Northern Ireland, we're talking about the north of England. If we, as Harriet says, rupture those unfair structures...
Can I ask you what you mean by rupture those structures?
So take away their political power. Basically, as we've just said earlier,
okay,
the UK government has sovereignty, right? They've made themselves, in the UK Parliament, absolutely sovereign. They can click away the Welsh Parliament through various means, should they wish to, within a couple of months, and it could get royal assent, because as if the Queen actually cares. The same could happen to the Scottish Parliament. But again, if the Scottish vote for independence, that's another rupture. And that completely causes a structural cascade that we have to address. And this is why for so long I've said, let's get ahead of it.
You have to address it, but what does it actually achieve? I mean, what I struggle with is where the people fit within this, because if you take the Welsh Government's position at the moment, which is basically a form of federalist reform based on a voluntary union of nations, that is as much independence as any other version of independence, because it's based on the concept of what the people of Wales actually want. Now, the difficulty I have is the belief that somehow you have to smash up the UK Union rather than to reform it. Now, if you don't believe it is capable of reform, then that obviously leaves you the only that particular option. But if you believe there is the possibility of reform, that there is a possibility of a Labour government or a majority in Westminster to accept constitutional reform, then the question is, will people be better off by going down the road of constitutional reform as opposed to what is a fairly destructive breakup within which probably the most vulnerable people in our society will suffer the most?
Well, that's an assumption, Mick. You don't know that. So
well, let me tell you why. Oh, right, I'll tell you in a minute.
I think in terms of what the argument you were making previously about a mythological socialism that will come from an independent state, I think you're right to point that out. There is a lot of that attitude floating around. It's not one that I personally hold. I think a struggle within the United Kingdom would be very similarly replicated within Wales to try and overthrow a conversation about neoliberal politics and capitalism more broadly. But I think by having those conversations and by having the opportunity to have those conversations around what type of a nation we want to live in, what does our nation look like, who does the economy work for, whose interests does the economy work for, those radical conversations will inspire many people to start to understand that the British state puts obstacles in the way of those radical policies or reforms. And I'll give you a really good example, right? I've been listening to a podcast today about the Spy Cops inquiry that's going through Parliament in relation to the Spy Cops bill. I got interested in it, and I was listening to some people give evidence about how the British state ordered undercover surveillance into so many vast areas of radical politics in the United Kingdom and actively broke them up. Thousands and thousands of people from the NUM being infiltrated, the environmental movements, etc. This is one example of how the British state tries to take hold of radical energy and disperse it. In a conversation where in my vision for what we could do when we're asking people about independence is literally get assembly members like yourselves on a bus, travelling around Wales, having conversations in halls, asking people, what type of a country do you want to live in? What type of an economy do you want to live in? How do you want power to be shared? When have we ever had that conversation as part of the British state? Because I certainly can't remember it.
For some of us, those conversations have been going on for a long time. The question is what the ideological base of them is. And of course, they have been confined. I think part of the problem at the moment, I mean, you're absolutely right. We are moving to a stage where we have to have that debate now at a serious level. We have to have it particularly in England. It is absolutely vital with England because everything ultimately hinges in terms of future relationships and so on, and in terms of economic well-being, prosperity and so on. So we have to have that debate, and we have to have that debate in terms of what we want the structures of government to be. And I'll say this as well. I don't see devolution as being just about creating a totally autonomous parliament in Cardiff Bay for Wales. I think what we've seen during COVID is the importance of local government, and I think there are other mechanisms of actually devolving power even further down. I think part of the problem is devolution actually stopped when we actually created the Welsh assemblies and so on, in some ways, in terms of the process of handing power back to people and so on. But the Spy Cops thing, I mean, he's right. Listen, I remember as a student in the 70s, we knew who our special branch officer was. We used to wave to him as we went past, I mean, we sort of were aware of all those sorts of things. But they don't take us away from some of the fundamental questions that have got to be answered, and in terms of the structure have got to be answered. For example, within Wales, I mean, within the nationalist question, what would be the relationship between Wales and England? Would you be sharing a currency? Because if you share a currency, you are sharing a considerable level of power and shared sovereignty, and you're handing a lot of power over. So they're all serious questions. We have to answer also the question of, we do have a 13-14 billion pound deficit for all its faults and all the inadequacies of the funding formulas that we know exist within the UK. We know that if Wales were independent tomorrow, we would have to find 13 or 14 billion pounds to actually hold to fill within that. If we were in that that situation. The answer that, yes, but things will get so much better, etc., isn't really an answer to the most vulnerable. So we have to have a mechanism that allows the reform and the transition of the constitutional reform to take place. That is why I think the Constitutional Convention is going to be so important if it is done properly, if it is done right, and it is done that allows the really radical ideas to come through, which I think need to come through, because otherwise there will be a fragmented breakup of the UK. I'm convinced that will happen, but if it happens without constitutional reform within some sort of framework, it will be very divisive. It'll make Brexit look like a picnic, and there will be a lot of people who will suffer badly economically from it. That's why I'm so committed to the concept of a process that allows those changes to take place, which ultimately give the people of Wales a choice. Here is a new model, or new models that you can choose between, and you choose to either go in for that or not to go in for it, and so on. And that is where the choice of the people comes important, and that is what would ultimately determine whether the UK has a purpose to existence in the future or not.
Those are all really important points and questions. No one wants the people of Wales to get any poorer, because just this year we know that unpaid carers, the numbers have shot up above 650,000 people, and the UK government isn't providing any support for them. However, to go through those points as succinctly as is possible. So yes, constitutional reform and the consultation is absolutely important. Unfortunately for us, events are happening far quicker than any constitutional convention can keep up with. For example, we know that Brexit is going to happen in about 3 weeks in the worst possible way. We know that things are going to get more expensive. We know that things are going to slow down, and there will be a very different approach to food and the everyday life of people across the UK entirely, as of next month. It's not even a year away, it's a month away, if that. So yes, of course, I look forward to the Constitutional Convention ran by the UK Labour Party, as I did 2 years ago, as I did 2 years before that. Every time one's announced, I always look forward to it. When those events stop outpacing those constitutional conventions, I'll look forward to actually going to one. But I don't hold out as much hope as many others. I would say that the England problem is a big one, yes, but England does not yet want to answer it. It's great to see the Northern Independence Party come up and push that question. And they clearly, with that kind of big change, that kind of rupturing message, might make it happen in England. But we cannot hold out hope while people get poorer in Wales to do that. And when it comes finally to the Welsh deficit of an independent Wales, we have an economy of 75 billion GDP. That's incredible. And we collect about 30 billion in taxes. Now, the UK government gives us 18 billion and tells us we have a deficit of 15 billion. Except, of course, they charge us for all the things that they want. So where does that extra money go? In an independent Wales, we would be in charge of our finances, and some argue that we need to be in charge of our own currency so we can implement things that alleviate poverty, like UBI, that Westminster was entirely resistant to, even with a great letter cross-party organised by Kevin Brennan and Beth Winter, brilliant MPs of ours in London, organised cross-party. UK government didn't even bother to respond to it in any proper way. I'd love for there to be great change across the UK, but events are coming quicker and we need to be ahead of them.
The question I was going to ask is, if anyone has read the Clyde report towards an independent Wales, their version of independence looks an awful lot like what a lot of people in the Labour Party have called confederalism. Do you envisage, once this constitutional convention takes place, I'm going to say it will for this purpose, when it does take place, that you could ever envisage a situation where Labour could walk hand in hand with Plaid to get this constitutional change done, if it looks similar to what they desire and what we eventually pick, Mick?
Yeah, if we can make progress with the Constitutional Convention, if we can come up with, firstly, I think it has to be all party. It has to work in all those who want to participate within it. This is not something that can be done sort of with Labour wanting to impose, etc. When you are reforming the structure of the nations and the societies of the UK, it has to be something that embraces, you know, all the different communities and processes for the future, because you want something that is going to be sustainable for 50 to 100 years and is capable of reform as change takes place. So just as with achieving devolution, I mean, I was involved in the 79 referendum for devolution, that ill-fated thing, etc. And you know, there was a cross-party. I mean, with the Wales for the Assembly campaign was cross-party. Elliston Morgan, then Labour MP, now retired judge, led it, and there were representations from across the parties. It can happen, it has to happen. The main differences that exist between, say, Plaid and Labour over the independence issue are really over a nation-based approach as opposed to a class-based approach. Those are the main differences. In terms of the objective, and that is empowerment and so on, there is an enormous amount of common ground. And you know, whereas we may well be sorting out what our position is as a party on a UK basis as what we think that constitutional reform should take place, the process of constitutional reform has to be something that embraces other political parties as well.
Harriet, do you think that the version of independence or confederalism that Plaid and some in Labour talk about are the same thing? And do you think that the visions of Wales that independent supporters within the Labour Party and those implied to support independence are the same, or do you think that they're asking slightly different questions of that future nation?
Look, I haven't read this bloody document, so I'm not going to pretend I have, okay? But what I can comment on, I had a conversation with my partner about this, actually, because he's not convinced about independence. So we were chatting about, he asked some of the questions that Mick was asking about, you know, like, what type of a movement is the movement for independence? And you've just touched on it there. And I tend to think that I can see the people that are joining Yes Cymru in their droves and in great numbers are either disaffected Labour Party Corbynistas or young Plaid Cymru lefties. So I think there is a lot of work that can be done there. Obviously, there's going to be a traditional constituency of, you know, old-fashioned Plaid Cymru, soft Tory voters who are going to be in that coalition, but I imagine there's a lot of work that could be done between left-wing Labour Party members, left-wing Plaid Cymru members to try and come to analysis that does include the full gamut of class politics rather than national politics. I think, to be honest, we push at an open door if we started to have those conversations. We just don't start to have them because every time someone in the Labour Party brings it up, another member of the Labour Party is like, nationalism, and just shuts the whole thing down. So I am more than willing to have those conversations with those members, and I think it's something that we should be trying to do for certain.
I don't know what constituency you're in, because we don't have that problem with those debates. I mean, we've actually had these debates in my constituency. I know they've had them in Cunnan as well, you know, and I think there is a clearly changing nature of the debate that is taking place. The debate is growing, you know. I'm involved already with a group where we're trying to actually develop an alternative policy to either we think the choices aren't just between a sort of hardline nationalism and a hardline unionism, actually, that there is actually a mechanism which is based on decentralisation and empowerment. Now, all those variations of debates actually are really important, but they are going. I can tell you, I mean, you know, when I joined the Labour Party in 74, the politics was extremely different. It was actually quite internationalist in a very hardline way, but the debate has changed because the economy has changed, society has changed. We are now in a global capitalist economy. We are in an environment where we no longer have those global institutions, whether it be the mines, the steelworks, institutions that actually created almost the structure of the UK state. All those things have gone. The nature of technology has changed matters, and that's why the nature of politics has to become more diverse. That is why language is so more important, because identity has become much more important in the modern world, you know, where you have 3 or 4 major sort of cultural influences and so on.
Ben, you've been involved in Yes Cymru and Labour for a long time. Is there this common ground? Do you think there is a common vision for that?
I think there is. I think that obviously the movement being so, the Esk-Cymru movement, that is, the independence movement being so vast as it is now, there of course are going to be different points. But it's funny that Mick should mention Elistan Morgan. He was one of our patrons when we first started Labour for Indie Wales, because he, like Carwyn now, recognised that confederalism has to come through a push for independence, and fairer structures only come through clarity, and fairer class-based politics only comes through that. Having read the Plaid document, I actually think it's a bit neoliberal, and it's not what I would want. But I know that they're way more radical than that, and they're the sort of younger, the Plaid Ifanc. They're as radical as we are. And sometimes we're more radical than them. You know, I'm an eco-socialist. I want a sustainable future. The idea that Wales should be a nation just to be another independent nation and continue in a neoliberal vein doesn't really ring true from my experience throughout the movement. What I can definitely say is that they are internationalist, they are inclusive, they want everyone in Wales, no matter where anyone's from, to be a part of the independence movement and to establish a fairer, and it's about that. So many times, so many of us agree, it's about fairness. And that is, in many ways, the most simple way you can put class politics. If something isn't fair, then it isn't right. And as it is, while, you know, the Tax Justice Network proved last year that London extracts wealth from its UK peripheries, that isn't fair, that isn't right. And what it does is it takes that wealth from poorer people and it gives it to the richest, just like the Tories have proved in the COVID crisis. They'll take money from the Bank of England and give it to their friends, their rich already friends, and leave many of us, poorer people, suffering and without. And really, that is, you know, the cross point between the traditional nationalist politics and the class politics that I'm pushing for, and you know, so many in Labour for Indie Wales and the independence movement are pushing for. It's about creating that fairness, and that's where that umbrella really meets in the middle.
I think the key, for me, the key challenge is, can the UK be reformed? If it is reformed, how would you want it to be reformed? And if it is reformed, is Wales being better part of it? Now, that depends exactly on what the content of those arguments is. One of the objections I have, or one of the disagreements I have with the nationalist movement, apart from the total usual lack of actually definitions as to what you're actually talking about, and there is a real issue over this, because I've been involved in arguments where we're talking about things and you have to go back to basics and say, well, look, you have to define what you're saying first, so I know whether when I use this description the same thing. But one of the things we mustn't forget in all of this, because there's a real danger in this, it turns into a debate of political parties and political activists, and at the end of the day then loses out and forgets the fact that this is ultimately about the people of Wales, people of England, people of Scotland, and so on. Because if there was a referendum tomorrow on independence, and however you defined it, leaving those arguments to one side, I've no doubt that we'd lose it hands down. I've actually no doubt that there is a very substantial majority that want to see a relationship with England as part of a UK. The arguments are, of course, you have to define what that is. At the moment, that relationship, I mean, listen, the best cheerleaders for the breakup of the UK at the moment are Boris Johnson. And I don't think they care that much, because they've been sucked into a fairly right-wing concept of a British Anglo-centric nationalism, etc. And that is destructive in itself, and it does make the independence just talking about this, anything to break away from that makes it very, very, very attractive. You know, you just have to. It's just, I think, as socialists, we have to see far deeper than that in terms of the economics, the impact, and what the options are in terms of structural reform and so on, and also empowerment. So it is a very complex, but it does take us back to the very crux of this. And that is, we have not been having the debate we should have. We have got to have a political debate about where we're going to go, about these things that can affect us, and what the various options are, because there aren't only two options. I think there may be 4 or 5 versions of the same option. You know, you talk about independence, there could be 4 or 5 different versions of that. But at the end of the day, it's got to be a debate. that engages people, in which people feel that they have some role within it, and that it is about their future rather than a carve-up of politics by the political parties.
I can agree with that entirely, and I'd love to add, if we can, I remember Carwyn Connect being really popular. I'd love us in Welsh Labour to be able to take that kind of platform again. I don't see why our leadership cannot lead those debates and conversations around Cymru. Over to you, Harriet.
Like, we're all in agreement. We need to debate these issues. My only concern and the only problem that I have, having lived in Scotland in the referendum and now living here in this build-up towards what we're seeing with Yes Cymru, is that the horse is bolted on some of the options. Offering a federal UK to Scotland, you'll just get laughed at. I mean, the Labour Party is laughed at in Scotland. So the Labour Party making a constitutional convention recommendation for federalism across the UK, like, good luck. Like, all power to you, but it's not going to happen. And I think in terms of a referendum, I think Mick's right. If we had one tomorrow, we would lose it. But the point is that we have a build-up to those referendums and we have conversations across the country and we win people over. Just like in an election, we have a long campaign and a short campaign, and we win people over like we had to do in the last election to vote for Jeremy Corbyn and vote for a socialist government, which was very difficult. We'll have to do very similar things across the country if we have an independence referendum. And I saw in Scotland at the beginning of when these conversations started happening, yes, Scotland was a bit niche actually. It wasn't the mainstream organisation, and it was a bit like, oh God, he's got a yes sticker on. But then suddenly, every single person for about 4 years was talking about the different arrangements that an independent Scotland could have. And in terms of like politicisation, it was one of the most impressive politicisations of a group of people I have ever seen. We had teenagers in the Glasgow, is it the Hydro? Anyway, they did a question time for just teenagers, school-age kids, and the questions they were coming up with, I was like, bloody hell, like if we had that discussion in Wales, I'd like fall out of my chair. So even like that process of debate and discussion about the future of the nation, I think would do some great headway towards us politicising people.
Harry, you were obviously there during 2014, and we've seen today a poll which shows independent support in Scotland up at 58%, and it's one of many that have been sort of around that ballpark. Do you think that the UK Labour Party's position would have to change if Scotland were to leave the UK?
Definitely. So I was discussing with some colleagues today actually about this result and how the SNP is going to gain so much traction next year after seeing everything that's happened under COVID and seeing how, you know, the nations have been boxed out in these discussions. Scottish independence is going to happen. Even if people declare themselves independent and don't use the constitutional arrangements that they're meant to, like, that is becoming a serious option. That would not be my preferred option, obviously. That's a dangerous option, but like these things are going to happen. At which point, of course, Wales is going to need to do some self-reflection because as we can see already with the internal market bill, the Tories do not give a two hoots about about Wales and Welsh devolution and the voices of people in Wales. So at that point, of course, we'd have to discuss Welsh independence or discuss a different constitutional arrangement. I think people would definitely go for independence at that point because they'd be like, screw this, like this is a sinking ship.
Mick, what do you think? Do you think that if Scotland were to leave, Constitutional Convention question becomes completely different? How do you have a federal or confederal UK when it's just England, Wales, and maybe Northern Ireland? We don't even know what's going to happen with Northern Ireland.
Well, listen, I think you have to sort of take the process as to what might happen. You know, if the SNP have a very clear mandate from that, I think people of Scotland are entitled to another referendum, and there'll be arguments there. I think for me, the biggest problem during the 2014 Scottish referendum was when people said you should stay in the UK, no one could actually say why you should be in the UK or what the purpose of the UK was. So it was never actually an option. So you had actually quite a polarised debate. I know from the people I talked to with it in Scotland, I don't think it is quite as polarised in terms of two absolutely clear. I think there are a lot of people with varying views in terms of what the relationship with England or with Wales or within the UK should be, but will fall one side to the other because that is the nature of that debate at the moment. And I think that is the failure of Labour, is that at UK level, we haven't. I had hoped, I was arguing, several years back, this could have been Ed Miliband's really great statesmanship act to say we've got to sort out this constitutional mess in a way that is democratic, that is egalitarian, and reforms and gives people real options. But it was never seized. And in fairness, as a supporter of Jeremy, I think Jeremy didn't grasp the concept of that as well. And I think, Harriet, your analysis of potential events is right. Now, what changes in the dynamic? Well, it changes, but of course, even with a massive mandate, and even if there is then a referendum and it does it, the actual process of change is still an intensely complex one that leaves enormous questions still to be answered. And there's some of the questions I raised earlier. For example, within Scotland, will they retain the pound? Will they be part of that financial structure, etc.? Will they, what will be the trading relationship? Will it then be a free trade agreement? And what are the implications of that? Because all those things actually then require a shared sovereignty. I mean, this is the myth about the way the Tories are using the sovereignty argument. It's the fact of the matter is every country we engage with, every deal we do, every convention we sign up to involves a sharing of sovereignty. And that, and I made the point, for example, during the Brexit debate, Britain leaving the EU, Britain was no less independent as part of it in the EU than leaving it, and Wales would be no more or less independent being part of the UK or out of it. The question is whether it has the consent of the people, and it's what the people actually want. So, I think there are still many turns and twists in the actual issue of constitutional reform, irrespective of it. But what the Scottish result may well do is just catalyse that debate even further and make it a necessity, rather than up to now something that can be pushed to one side, particularly from the English perspective. And somebody mentioned earlier that well, there isn't a debate. Well, there is a sort of debate. I actually think what the divisions that began to occur between the north of England and the south are actually part of that growing diversity and fragmentation that's taken place within England itself. It just hasn't achieved a political format within it, and that's why it's such important that there is a constitutional convention. So that's why I think it is an important announcement.
Scotland leaving changes everything, and I think it's unwise to say it doesn't. If Scotland leaves, you have unpoliticised people like my neighbours, literally one of whom does not vote, but I have had this conversation with him, and he's like, I'd register to vote and I'd register to be an independent supporter. Overnight, unpoliticised people overnight would suddenly say, if they're going, well, we're bloody well going too. These are people that don't need the complicated processes of international frameworks and legal wranglings that we all know have to happen. We're talking like all voters are rational. They're not. Voters don't look at all the options. The rational choice model of voting behaviour is outdated. The most recent, obviously, is the valence model, that obviously, if you want to talk political theory and whatnot, but we don't really, because that's just boring. But, they might look for competence, they might look for leadership, they might look for identity. What they'll often do is go with their gut. And, I'm from an area that has never, ever, ever voted on a constituency level for a Labour Party member. It's the only place in Cymru, it's the only place in Wales that's never had a Labour representative. And yet, if I don't bring up Labour, when I talk to anyone about Scottish independence, and then I say, okay, so what happens if they go? Should Wales go too? They go, yeah, of course. And these are from Tories to Greens to Labour to Plaid to the Nutters to whatever. This isn't about, should Labour have the existential question? Should we wrangle with ourselves? Should Northern England fight with Southern England? It doesn't matter. If Scotland goes, that's it. That's the big domino. It's not even the first domino, by the way. The Internal Market Bill might as well be the first domino, but actually there were many smaller ones before it. But yeah, once Scotland goes, that's it. That's it. That's the end of the union, as is. No question.
I find it so fascinating that no one knows about the internal market bill and no one's really discussing it. Like, I've seen like a couple of Scottish podcasts talking about it. I've seen Jeremy obviously talking about it on Twitter, but you'd think this would kick up much more of a stink than it is. I don't know how it's like slipped under the radar. It's baffling me.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think I spent almost most of the last year talking about the internal market bill and writing about it. I think the problem is that with everything that's happening, with the economic pressures on people, with COVID, my constituency flooding and so on, the moment you start talking about intergovernmental relationships, and the constitutional structure of trade agreements and so on, quite frankly, I mean, for many people, what they really want to know is, are they going to have a job? Are they going to have a decent living? What's COVID going to do to their work? How are they going to manage, and so on? And there's a great danger in so many of these things that we actually engage in a debate that for many people are just not interesting. Not that I did a report to the Senate a while back on constitutional reform, and I opened it by saying this is probably the most boring report you will ever read, one that no one will ever raise with you on the doorstep. But it is one of the most important reports, because what happens in terms of our constitutional structures actually affect the lives of people. It is about the mechanism for the sharing of power that affects people's lives. Somehow we have to translate the internal market bill and its implications into what it actually means. It means we cannot potentially introduce certain environmental legislation that we want. It means decisions that we can take on not spending £2 billion of our money on a 12-mile stretch of motorway, etc., can be overridden, and we can be charged for that. You have to put it in ways in which it actually puts it in the minds of people as saying that the decision that you may make to elect someone to get them to do this, that they may not now be able to do because of what's happening in London. Do you want that? And I think we haven't developed the politics of that debate and brought it to a level that people can actually grasp it is attack on their power.
This is the point I was trying to make. You might be writing about it loads, Mick, but it's not translating to people. I apologise, but you are a politician. So.
I am writing it for the Senate rather than, but you're right. I think even if I wasn't, I mean, I think trying to get over that boundary of the debate in terms of what impact it will have on people's lives is really quite fundamental. We may find this same sort of debate with the social partnership bill that the Senate is, the Labour government is developing, because it will really push, I suspect, the boundaries of devolution, and it will really raise that challenge.
Well, this is a key question I've got for you, actually. This isn't really to do with this debate, but now it's come up. Isn't this a flaw of the Welsh Government not being able to convey these things to ordinary folk and then undermining the point for devolution in the first place? If people don't understand the politics of the internal market bill and the social partnership bill, isn't that an obstacle to us as a devolved nation if people don't understand the politics of the Senate?
Well, listen, it is always an obstacle to understanding the workings of government, and I'm not sure, anywhere around the world where there are those great understandings. But you're right, the issue is one of political communication, the issue is one of debate, the issue is one within the Labour Party. I mean, I would actually say how many members of the Labour Party actually understand really what is happening, even amongst activists, other than the headlines. And that's one of the difficulties. One of the great difficulties as well, of course, is the Anglo-centric nature of media, that we've had, that we can have major issues happening. When we had what I thought was important legislation on opposing some of the Tory trade union legislation, I went to the media and they were in Wales and they weren't interested. They were more interested in the fact that someone was having a spat with someone else, because that makes that sort of a fight on telly between two people, rather than something that was actually really quite an important step that was being taken by government in standing up for workers' rights. And that you're right. That's the challenge. I'm not sure what all the answers are, but you're right in terms of we've got to have more of these debates. We've got to have people going around engaging in these debates, discussing, and we've got to have more forums on this. It's one of the things. What I hope perhaps a constitutional convention will actually lead to, that it will actually trigger that debate and start up those debates, a bit like we did have a bit during the devolution thing in '79, leading up to that. Very, very different debate to the one we had in the 97 devolution proposals as well. But
with this all in mind, We've talked a lot about independence, but I'm going to ask one question on the far alternative. Are any of you worried or have any sort of existential concern about the future of devolution in and of itself? We've seen things like this bill that will undoubtedly soon become an act. The Withdrawal Act last year did the same thing with the Sewell Convention, and the rise in numerous political parties who want to abolish the Senedd, with the Welsh Conservatives making a nod and wink in that direction too. Are any of you really concerned that abolition is as likely as independence?
I don't think abolition is as like. I think there's a clear majority in terms of cross parties in support for the Senedd and for devolution. I just think that devolution as a concept itself has now moved into a different realm of four nation government. My bigger concern about the sort of abolish assembly is basically a sort of a an attempt to latch on to a sort of fairly right wing populism. By fairly far-right individuals using the proportional structure that we have to actually get into the Senedd in the first place, to give them a base. My concern is it is divisive. We saw how politically destabilizing the Brexit referendum was, and the divisions that began to occur. And I think they are still stirring up and promoting that. And it's no surprise that those that are promoting that are also promoting far-right issues. One of them even wants to bring back smoking into pubs, but the attacks on refugees, the attacks on immigrants, the subliminal racism which they deny they are, but which is inherent in their policies, and also the neoliberalism of their policies. But also, the bizarre thing about, the Welsh Conservatives, who really haven't developed as a party, as a Welsh Conservative party, to give a Welsh voice to that Welsh conservatism, which I don't think is healthy for Welsh democracy, really very much are a sort of appendage of number 10 Downing Street. The fact they will say, we will not spend in Wales on anything that is not specifically devolved to us, that is not reserved, etc. Well, if that was the case, then half the spending we're doing on transport and public transport, the money we're spending on the internet, we probably wouldn't be able to have this meeting now, because we wouldn't have the internet, because it's not a devolved matter, and so on. That is a very worrying trait, that you have a Conservative Party that is actually trying to compete now with the far right element, in the hope it will increase their base. And I think that's bad for Welsh democracy, that you don't have a strong Conservative Party with a clear Welsh agenda.
That's a really interesting point. I think in terms of like the far right groupings in the Senedd, whether they've moved from Brexit Party to wherever they're going, like they're Muppets, right? You've told me I can't swear, so they're Muppets, and Muppets are going to Muppet. My bigger concern is people who, under COVID, who didn't even know who Mark Drakeford was, right, before COVID. And then suddenly they've got to follow two sets of rules. They've got Boris saying one set, and then this new Drakeford guy saying another set, and they've become newly educated about the functioning of the Senedd and, the powers that the Senedd have. If that goes badly, if we have constituents across Wales seeing Mark Drakeford as having failed under COVID, then I can see how they could tap into, I'm not saying he has, but if they see it as that, I could see how they could tap into a sentiment of, well, what's this assembly? What's it done for me? But messed up on COVID, who's this Drakeford? Blah, blah. I can see that being a sentiment that I'd be more concerned about than far-right Muppets who are like diminishing in number.
I'm a little more concerned, I think, than our other panelists. I'm not someone who thinks the abolish argument is growing, not at all. I think actually it's shrinking, but I think alongside the Conservatives, as you said, giving a nudge and a wink to that, we're very much in danger of a future of what Leighton Andrews called Dino, devolution in name only. And then the Conservatives, or whoever they feel they can get some form of deal with, then saying, oh, well, actually, it's only devolution, maybe it should have less powers. And then over the course of, and again, not instant, not abolish, but over the course of 10 or 20 years, they've gone from what is a tax-raising parliament proper to less powers to, oh, it's only really a talking shop. And then it's only really a place where politicians retire to, or it's only really some rubbish that we don't actually need. And it's at that point that the slow grind, just like Brexit, they've managed to overturn, in our case, 2 referenda that they will spend the next 20, maybe 40 years trying to do. And that's why going, as Harriet said, on the attack, being on the front foot within Welsh Labour, supporting self-determination is so important. I'm not going to go so far as to say, it's one or the other, because I don't think that at all. I think it's the constant political and philosophical battle that will rage. And even if we get independence, for the first 10 or 20 years, there'll still be people saying, oh yeah, we should just rejoin the British Empire. As there were after the Commonwealth was dissolved, oh, we should just be the British Empire again. As there still are people saying that, till the statehood of Cymru is finalised and proper and insoluble, then those long-term and short-term attacks are open and we are vulnerable to them.
Oh, I agree. Listen, you're spot on that insofar as it goes to the actual core of the constitutional change, and that is it's about sovereignty and it's about the issue of shared sovereignty, and that is that the relationship between the constitutional relationship has to be one that is no longer changeable in that sense. That is, it is no longer about a Westminster government devolving powers. That's why I think devolution has gone now in terms of it's done its purpose, etc., and we've moved on, and maybe that's why we're beginning to have this debate, and the arguments are beginning to become more polarized, because it should not be possible for Westminster to basically intrude, and the fact that we don't have any constitutional framework that enables for dispute resolution and so on, any process of that adds to that as well. I mean, there is a transitional thing in terms of the Joint Ministerial Council that would provide a transitional forum, but it wouldn't provide a long-term solution. And the ideological position has got to be that sovereignty belongs to the people and not to parliaments, and that you have a structure that actually recognises that you have a four-nation approach, and the structure of the UK has got to be one that recognises that. And it is a big challenge for Westminster, because there's a lot of people out there who don't understand the concept of sovereignty. They see it in terms of a sort of oligarchic power, and that has to change as well.
On that note, I just want to say thank you, all of you, for coming on the show this evening. If people want to find you on Twitter, what is your handle? Starting with Mick.
Mick Antoniw 1.
Sorry,
Harriet?
it's Haza_PS.
Thank you very much. And Ben?
Mine's just my name, Ben Gwalchmai, but I have a locked account, so you're probably better looking at Lab 4, numeric 4, Indie Wales.
Thank you very much, everybody. If you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't hesitate to find us on Medium at HiraethBlogCymru, on Facebook at HiraethBlogCymru, and on Twitter at HiraethBlog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.